Hello again. Today, I guess I gave back the first effort that you made. I gave back your grades, and I'll just make a few comments about the work that you did. I think everybody sort of understood that there was this contradiction between the French saying they were going to bring civilization and the reality of economic exploitation that was going on in Vietnam. I guess insofar as there were problems, and the grades were quite high, but there were some problems, and one was, I think, that some of you missed the sort of ironic element to the question, in the sense the French are bringing civilization to Vietnam, but as I pointed out in the early lectures, Vietnam itself had a civilization that was 1,000 years old, an offshoot certainly of Chinese civilization, but nevertheless, it had all of the elements of what we consider to be a civilization, which would be things like a state, monumental architecture, economic classes, writing. There are various elements that go into civilization. Well, Vietnam was a civilization. You know, the idea that the French thought that only European civilization, the Europeans were civilized, and in particular because they were so proud of what their accomplishments, they had this incredible sense of cultural superiority, being French. So some people didn't mention that, and so that was a problem. I would say, I'm just talking about where there were some problems. Most of you were right quite well. Some of you, in terms of the sort of your style, your sense of organization, it needs a little bit of work. And of course, I'm keeping these assignments. I keep this assignment very small, because what I really am looking for is something that's quite polished. If you only have to write 2 pages, make an effort to sort of really polish the work, because it's important that one of the things you need to achieve is a sense of really how to write a really good essay, how to write good prose. It's important, is an important part of your training at the university. Certainly critical skills are important, but also being able to write a good essay is also important. Are there any questions about this little piece? Okay, so the agenda then is that on Friday, after class, I'm going to send you the midterm examination. And as I've already said, it will be chosen from the first 10 review questions, which we're going over. And I will choose 3, and you answer 2. So I'll send this as an email after the class on Friday, and you give it back to me. You upload it on Monday before class. And in terms of preparing, of course, last Friday, I reviewed the first 8 questions, and they're up on YouTube. You can consult them as you need to. So that's, I couldn't give you more. And we're going to do the other 2 questions at the beginning of this class. So this is the way we're proceeding. Are there any questions about the upcoming midterm? Very good.
I actually had one question. There's no limit to how many like pages you can write, right? It's just
No, there's no
probably
limit, but
it's gonna be like an argumentative essay essentially for each question.
That's true. And I enjoy reading them. Some of you are doing quite good work. It's interesting. But there has to be an end. So, you don't want to write a book. You want something good, 3 or 4 pages. If you're really enthusiastic, 5, 6, but no more than that. And some people can express themselves in a very succinct way, make all the points, and it needn't be more than 3 pages. It can be 3 pages.
Okay.
It's really the main thing is to be able to give me a reasonably well written, and it should have obviously some theoretical position answering the question, and it should have detail, some that shows that you sort of understand the flow of the narrative. That's what I think is necessary.
Okay,
Any
so
other?
So sorry. So it's not like the traditional midterm or traditional. So
No.
there's no lockdown browser. You can use the resources you have to obviously don't plagiarize anything like that, obviously. But what I meant was
do that. You could do that. But you need what? Because I guess I don't want to boast, but I feel that my narrative is a good narrative, and I've taken account of. I gave you a bibliography at the beginning of the class. I think in the narrative, a lot of what I've read, obviously not all, is embodied in the narrative. So yes, you could supplement what you're saying with other materials, but it isn't necessary. I mean, I'm not looking for a big set of footnotes, to tell you the truth. I'm looking for the content.
My question was essentially, so we have unlimited time until Monday before class essentially to write it, because it'll be in the email.
That's right.
Thank you. Yeah,
that's right. Okay.
Sorry, I have a question. Do you want us to use Chicago style footnotes, or can we use like the simplified just in parentheses like we used?
I think in parentheses is better, and then put the if you draw up a bibliography of whatever sources that you've used. Okay. Okay. So we only had 2 questions left in the last class, questions 9 and 10. And they're quite straightforward. What were the bases of support of the Diem government? Well, you start out the Catholics, a little bit on the Catholics, some from the north, some in the south, and so on. This Catholic minority was foundational to the regime. Then, obviously, the Vietnamese who were in the French colonial army or in the bureaucracy, they supported Diem. In addition to them, there were the landlords, obviously, who wanted their land back. Then there was the Chinese and the Vietnamese bourgeoisie. And here you want to make a point that one of the things that Diem did with the help of the Americans was to build up the bourgeoisie, build up the middle class by giving them preferential treatment. So the landlords, the middle class, and then also you could say that Diem, his family, his political party, his youth movement, these were the constitutive elements of the Diem government. And finally, of course, you would underscore how important American help was. American support was absolutely founded. The money and the military support of the United States was absolutely indispensable. So these were the elements, and maybe you could mention that at the end of the day, it was a regime which was shaky from the very beginning. As I pointed out, it was based on the Catholic minority, which the Buddhist majority increasingly were resentful of. Secondly, yes, the bourgeoisie were strengthened, but they never did get. They were dependent on American economic aid. They never did develop an independent economy, a self-sustaining economy. And that proved to be a basic weakness. And finally, of course, because they refused until late in the game to introduce land reform, the peasants were mainly alienated from them. And of course, the insurgency was based on the peasantry. So those are some of the weaknesses. So that's question 9. Question 10 deals with Kennedy. Prior to the assassination, US President John Kennedy was seriously considering American withdrawal from Vietnam. Now, the reason I pose this question is that there are still people who write about this subject and who will claim that Kennedy really wanted to get out, and that this actually, I think, in the common view of this question is Kennedy wanted to withdraw, and this is based on essentially 2 things. One, following Mike Mansfield's press conference, where the leader of the Senate said that the war was being lost and that the United States should get out, Kennedy met with Mansfield and said, yes, I will get out, but after the elections. I can't do it before because the Republicans will use this as election ammunition. And you could also say that after all, he did settle for a deal in Laos. Remember I said that when the regime collapsed in Laos, Kennedy, using the Russians as intermediaries, arranged for the neutralization of Laos. So maybe he could have done the same thing. Those are what you could say about Kennedy wanting to get out. But the truth is that quite the reverse. The neutralization of Laos for Kennedy basically cleared the deck for basically a deeper involvement in South Vietnam because he was not prepared to accept neutralization or a possible communist takeover. No, he saw South Vietnam in a similar way to South Korea, that it was important to the whole policy of containment. And here you want to say that Kennedy was absolutely convinced of the logic of the American policy of containment, which marked the whole Cold War. That was the essential framework out of which he was looking at things. So there's that. But the other points that should be made is, in addition to this idea of containing communism, and particularly the Chinese, there was also the idea of sort of repelling third world revolutionary movements. The Cuban Revolution in 1959, Kennedy had been humiliated at the Bay of Pigs in '61, and Vietnam was, for Kennedy, he was, of course, developing the whole program against Castroism, against the spread of Castro's ideas in Latin America, the Alliance for Progress, and which was a kind of economic program to create a middle class, but also he was developing counterinsurgency warfare. It was under him. The Green Berets come along, the use of helicopters in third world conflicts. This is all the concept of modernization as an ideology. It's all very salient during the Kennedy administration. And so we could say that containment, the whole counterinsurgency movement are all the way Kennedy saw the problem in Vietnam. And then smaller points, but nevertheless important, are that when the Buddhist crisis blew up, rather than using that as a justification for getting out, he basically determined that it was necessary to get rid of Diem and put somebody that would be more subservient to the United States, and possibly it would be more liberal government, a more open government, better than Diem. And he sent Henry Cabot Lodge to Vietnam to get rid of Diem. So that would be the answer to that. Okay, are there any further points we need to discuss relative to this preparation? So I'm sending out the exam following the next class. Okay? So today, of course, we broke off our discussion at the point where on the 1st of November, '63, the Diem regime was overthrown by a military coup d'etat with the approval of the United States. And Diem tried to flee, but he was ultimately captured by the army, and he and his brother, Mr. New, were assassinated. So what we're going to see today, the main direction of things today, is first of all, how far from stabilizing, getting rid of Diem, far from stabilizing the situation politically, actually the situation deteriorated. There was no political stabilization. On the contrary, there was a political anarchy broke out, as you see. And the counterinsurgency began to really get worse and worse. The military situation got worse and worse. Indeed, the first regular army troops from North Vietnam began to cross the 17th parallel in 1964. And so in response to this, in order for to avoid a complete defeat, the Americans first began an air war. They began to bomb Vietnam, and particularly North Vietnam. And when that didn't stop the communists, they began to dispatch more and more American ground troops. And this is so we're looking at how the Americans really became entangled in this war, up to the hilt, we can say. They became completely mired in this conflict in Vietnam, and this is the narrative that explains how this happened. So, as I said, that the population as a whole welcomed the overthrow of Diem, and Kennedy and his administration, they said, well, Diem, because of his authoritarianism and his inflexibility, had brought his ruin on upon himself. They disowned, the Kennedy administration disowned any responsibility. And of course, they hoped that things would now go better. Of course, Kennedy himself, and this is dramatic, 3 weeks after Diem was assassinated, John Kennedy met his death in Dallas, Texas. I think it was the 23rd of November, 1963. It was a huge, dramatic event, the assassination of Kennedy. And of course, it fueled all sorts of conspiracy theories to this day as to who was really responsible for this assassination. And you have there's a whole massive literature about Kennedy's assassination. You probably, some of you are probably familiar with these ideas. This conspiracy, it was the Cubans that were responsible, it was the mafia. I guess I.F. Stone, there's a film about the Kennedy, and there's a very sort of interesting film. Basically, I don't accept its analysis, but it's a very good film by Oliver Stone. He claims the mafia did it. But one could say, well, maybe the sort of remnants of the Diem regime. After all, they killed Diem, so maybe it was tit for tat. Maybe these are the people who killed Kennedy. Well, my own view basically is that Oswald killed, in the absence of any real evidence. I do believe history. There are conspiracies in history, and politicians conspire. Businessmen conspire all the time to fix things. But on the face of things, if you don't have evidence, I don't think it's the right thing to do, to sort of invoke conspiracies just like that. Oh yeah, there was all these people about who claim that the 7th of the 11th of September and so on, the attack on the World Trade Center was an inside job. No, I don't think so. I think it was the Saudis, these Saudis, that did it. But there are people that are just insane about this. Anyway, please, if you want to chip in or say something, go ahead. Because things deteriorated in the wake of Kennedy's death, and the Americans were forced to eventually intervene. Now, Kennedy was gone, and which brings me to the vice president, Lyndon Johnson. And how about him as a conspirator? Now, if you ask me, well, if there's anybody who might have knocked off John Kennedy, it would be Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson was really evil, this guy. You have to really get into it to understand this guy. He came from Texas. He was a Texas politician, represented the oil interests in Texas. He was basically a crook, and he was very aggressive, and he rose to the top of the Senate and ultimately Kennedy, to balance his ticket, made him the vice presidential candidate. He had super ambitions, this guy. And he certainly knew Texas politics and he knew American politics. But what he didn't know was foreign affairs. He knew nothing about foreign affairs. He knew in a consummate way how to manipulate American politics. But since he knew nothing about the external world, he had to depend on his advisors. And for him, for Lyndon Johnson, it was, the idea was, oh, I'm going to be like Harry Truman. I'm going to fight the Russians. I'm going to fight communism. Very sort of simple ideas that, of course, rang a bell. It was a sort of dominant ideology of the Cold War. This was his framework, but he had no experience of foreign relations. Isn't everybody an American? Was his view of things. Basically, that was his view of the world. And so he had to rely on his advisors. The foremost of whom was McNamara, and I'll mention him again. But there were other people like Walt Rostow was in the administration. I mentioned him. He was the author of the book on modernization I spoke about previously. And there were other guys from Harvard. Harvard, listen, these people at Harvard and Yale, they have enormous influence in American politics. And he was surrounded by Johnson, by these characters. And their sort of whole reputation and careers basically depended on basically winning in Vietnam. That was their view. They were Cold Warriors. Obviously, these people were way more sophisticated than Lyndon Johnson, but that was their framework. Now, as for McNamara, I said that he was a technocrat. He was a master of quantitative method. He had used it in the Ford Motor Company during World War II as president of the Ford Motor Company. And he ran the war as a kind of sort of a techno war, a computer war. There's so many, you put in the inputs, they measure your progress. They also measure what the enemy is doing as reported by electronic listening devices. And you draw the proper logistical and strategic conclusions. And all of this was related to the idea that basically you could engineer the outcome of a war. You could engineer it in the same way you build a vast construction project. You carry on a war in the same way. It's a kind of industrial construction project. And the whole idea is nation building in the reflection of the United States of America. You build up these nations and basically through this process of American modernization, you transform them into sort of images of the United States. A good illustration would be South Korea as a modern economy, deeply marked by this process of nation building on the part of the United States. Obviously, in terms of American economic and political ideas, or a country like Chile would be another example, or for that matter, even a place like West Germany, Germany after the war. Obviously, it's still German, but the American influence is enormous. So the other thing I would say, maybe I've already said it, but it's worth repeating. this idea, the new wrinkle about McNamara was the Americans have always fought their wars, certainly since the Civil War, as kind of industrial wars. You overwhelm the enemy by the amount of firepower that you bring to bear on the military conflict. You mobilize the economic capacity to just destroy the enemy's capacity to fight. That was their view. And of course, added to that is the computerization of this whole process by McNamara. So those are the people who are directing this war. Now, in Vietnam itself, of course, Diem had been swept aside, and there was a junta, there was a group of generals who now controlled the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And the lead general was a guy by the name of Duong Van Minh. Now, Duong Van Minh was unusual amongst Vietnamese in that he was quite tall. The Vietnamese, at least back then, were short, especially when compared to North Americans. But Duong Van Minh was tall. And so the American press called him Big Minh. It's a kind of familiar nickname, Big Minh. Well, Big Minh, he did put an end to some of the worst abuses of the Diem period, the prison camps, arbitrary arrests, and so on, suppression of basic liberties. All of that was abolished by this new junta, this new military regime. But no sooner did Minh take power than he began to say that we need to begin to look for a negotiated settlement with the National Liberation Front and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He said South Vietnam should be neutralized. In other words, he picked up on, at the last minute, you remember Diem and New began to speak about the need to neutralize South Vietnam. Well, that's exactly what Minh began to advocate. Meanwhile, the National Liberation Front, and must bear this in mind, remember, the National Liberation Front is created in 1961. The insurgency is already developing by 1961. And now we're in 1963, 64, and the insurgency is gaining more and more ground. The insurgency, that's in the background. And the first elements of the PAVN, of the People's Army, has crossed the 17th parallel. So the communists are making progress. And of course, they're aware that the regime is weakened because Diem has been swept aside. So they speed things up. This is what happens. Well, Johnson and his advisors, when they learned about Minh's direction, that is towards neutralization, they were horrified by this. And from their point of view, if there was some negotiation, maybe the formation of a coalition government with the communists, this would simply mean the next step after that would be a complete communist takeover. So their view was, we made a mistake. We allowed Big Minh to take power, and we have to get rid of him. So they actually sponsored a second coup, and one of the generals that they believed was reliable, his name was Khan, Nguyen Khan, they he got the go-ahead from the CIA, and on January 30th, 1964, this is just a few months after the assassination of Diem, a second coup takes place. Big Min is ousted, and Nguyen Khan, another military man, takes over at this point. Now, this move, far from stabilizing things in the American perspective, opened the door to what is called the coup season, because following this second coup, there were in succession over the next a year or two, 5 more military coups as successive generals tried to seize power from one another. And of course, you can imagine the insurgency is making progress in the countryside, and there's no stable government in Saigon. There's just a succession of coups. So this was a really terrible situation. The American first response was basically, we need to send as much economic and military equipment as we can to try and staunch the bleeding here. So the American commitment rose precipitously in this situation of chaos. One of the desperate measures that they began to take was, well, if they couldn't handle the situation properly, they had this idea that they would begin to harass the North Vietnamese. And so American naval vessels loaded ARVN troops, South Vietnamese troops, on board these naval vessels, and they went up to the coast of North Vietnam, and they began to, in secret, sort of hit North Vietnamese military installations along the coast, a secret military operation. Now, that was the immediate sort of military response of the United States, but meanwhile, they looked from Washington, they looked north to Ottawa, to the Canadians. Come and help us. You remember that Canada had assumed, with a certain amount of arm twisting, a role in the settlement of the Geneva Conference. The International Control Commission, Canadians, there were about 250 Canadians involved in Vietnam. They were supervising the Geneva Accords. So Canada was involved, but lucky for Canada, I should say, because they had this role, they were able to keep out of the military conflict. Anyway, the Johnson administration contacted the Pearson administration. Lester Pearson was the Prime Minister of Canada. And at the American behest, a diplomat by the name of Blair Seaborn was sent to North Vietnam to confront the North Vietnamese government and to give them an ultimatum. Unless you stop your insurgency, unless you stop your infiltration, we are going to, this is the Americans, he's carrying the message, Seaborn. Unless you do this, you're going to experience a major escalation of the war. We're giving you an ultimatum here. Back off. And this is the message that Seaborn brings to North Vietnam. Now, he has this interview with the foreign minister of North Vietnam, of the Democratic Republic, a seasoned communist by the name of Phan Van Dong. And you could see this Phan Van Dong in the films, in the series, the TV history. There's an interview. And he's an extremely charming man, you wouldn't believe it. But basically, he says, nuts to you. You know, we're going to continue until South Vietnam is liberated. He categorically dismisses the American ultimatum. So that's the situation. I just want to say a few more words about Canada. Canada pursued this role as intermediary for the United States. They, in fact, they were the eyes and ears for the United States. They reported to Washington whatever they could pick up in the way of intelligence. And Canada sold the United States something like $2.5 billion of equipment during the Vietnam War. This is the beginning of the military industries in Canada, which have become very large, big business. Well, it started in this period. I should note at the same time, well, so I guess what I'm saying is Canada was involved up to its neck in this thing. However, at the same time, we have to say that the Canadian government, and Pearson was followed by Trudeau, when it came to giving refuge to Americans who were fleeing the war, was all in all, we don't know the exact number, but it could be as many as 200,000 American young men. They fled the United States to avoid being conscripted to go to Vietnam. They either deserted the army or they refused the draft. A very large number of people just immigrated, and many of them stayed in Canada and became Canadians during the war. There were also a relatively small number of Canadians who their ideology was essentially American, and they joined the American Army or the American Marines during the war, and they went to fight. They fought in Vietnam. So the Canadian involvement is rather complex. There are various elements to it. Now, meanwhile, while all this is happening, Johnson is facing re-election because Kennedy was elected in 1960. It's now 1964. November 1964, there's another American presidential election. So Johnson is up against an individual by the name of Goldwater, Barry Goldwater. And he comes from Arizona, and Barry Goldwater is extremely right-wing in every respect. In every respect, he is right-wing. It doesn't matter the aspect. He is an ultra-conservative. I'm talking about American internal affairs and what he believes. He believes in the total free market, no government, and so on. He's a precursor of neoliberalism, this guy. And so far as foreign policy goes, his foreign policy is, let's exterminate the Russians by dropping nuclear weapons on them. That's I'm not exaggerating. That's Goldwater. And so Johnson is able to put himself forward as a man of peace. I'm negotiating. I want to be firm with the communists, but I'm negotiating. There's the danger of nuclear war, and so I'm considering all these things. And so Johnson absolutely destroys Goldwater in this election of 1964. Goldwater's policies go nowhere. And so Johnson, at least Johnson, you should remember, after Kennedy died, did introduce some very important internal initiatives, the so-called war against poverty. I mean, that's a real oxymoron, if I ever heard one. A war against poverty. It says we're going to win the war in Vietnam, and we're going to conduct a war on poverty. At this time, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement is emerging very strongly. Some of the cities are already burning in the United States as this Black uprising begins to develop. within the United States. And so Johnson's counter to this is the war against poverty. So we have to make an onslaught against poverty. But at the same time, given Goldwater, he looks like relatively peaceful. And so his standing is high amongst the American public, which allows, in August 1964, Johnson is able to get a basic authorization of the American intervention into Vietnam. The legal basis of this is the so-called Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Here it's spelled on the screen, you see it right here. And I now need to bring up a map so that you can understand. This is the coast of Vietnam here, you see, not far from China, you see. And this area here is known as the Gulf of Tonkin, right here. I said earlier that American naval vessels secretly were escorting South Vietnamese troops who were being landed on the coast of North Vietnam. You can see this on the screen. In July 1964, a whole series of raids took place. American raids, essentially, on the North Vietnamese coast. And as a result of that, the North Vietnamese apparently sent out speedboats equipped with torpedoes. And on the 2nd of August, 1964, a USS Destroyer cruising in the Tonkin Gulf on this mission that I have described came under attack from these torpedo boats. And then 2 days later, there was apparently a second attack, or so it was claimed. Now, as a matter of fact, subsequent investigation has led to some people to say, in fact, the second attack never took place. In fact, some people go so far to say that the first attack did not take place, that this was a phony. These attacks were claimed by the United States, but in fact, they never took place. Now, I remain an agnostic on this. We'll see how things shake themselves out, whether that's true or not. But the point is, they were interpreted as attacks. And as a result, Johnson immediately ordered an air assault on various targets in North Vietnam. And the same day, this is the 5th of August, he introduced the Tonkin Gulf Resolution into the Congress, which, as I said, is the basic document which allowed the Johnson administration to go in with both feet to basically invade Vietnam with, at the end of the day, it was more than 700,000 troops. And if you look at the whole area surrounding Vietnam, the United States marshaled no less than 2 million men in this conflict. Well, we'll see how this Tonkin Gulf resolution worked out on Friday.